Good morning and welcome to the PHRN Linkage Luminaries Series 2001. And Kaya from Noongar country, where the PHRN national office is located. We acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of all the lands on which we're meeting today, including Noongar Boodja here in Perth, and a special acknowledgement to the traditional owners during NAIDOC Week this year. We note that this land was never ceded, and that the Indigenous people were the original scientists and educators on these lands. We continue to learn and benefit from their knowledge. PHRN webinars in 2021 are focusing on leaders in data linkage. In our Linkage Luminaries series, we're honored today to be hearing from Professor Emily Banks. Professor Emily Banks is a public health physician and epidemiologist. The main emphasis of her work has been in using large-scale evidence to identify actions to improve health and healthcare at an individual and population level. Her main areas of work are in chronic disease, large-scale cohort studies, Aboriginal health, and healthy aging. She's an NHMRC Principal Research Fellow and head of the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at ANU, and a visiting professor at the University of Oxford. Professor Banks was appointed a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences in 2017 and was recently appointed a member of the Order of Australia in the 2021 Australia Day Honours. Congratulations, Professor Banks, and welcome, and thank you so much for coming and being our linkage luminary today. I'm going to stop my screen sharing and turn over to Professor Banks.
So I'm very excited to be asked to do this. I've never been described as a luminary, so no pressure, obviously. But I'm particularly pleased to be talking about data to people who know and care about data. I really feel that I'm with my tribe when I'm doing this work. So I'm going to talk about how large-scale data actually provide the vision for effective population health, public health. And what I mean by that is it actually provides us with the evidence and the data and to actually implement effective public health. And when we have large-scale data, we're no longer kind of flying blind. So just getting my thing to move along. So I'm going to start with a background on data and health, and then I'm going to use results that we've obtained through data linkage to large-scale cohort studies to talk about recent results on smoking and health in Australia. And then my understanding is there's going to be, it's a fairly brief presentation, and then there'll be time for questions. So sometimes I like to imagine a world without data, and it's very hard to get people to think about that right now, to imagine a world now without data and without the evidence that we have. And what health would be like without data. But what we can think about is the historical counterfactual. So if we think about what medicine and health advice used to be like, it was basically bloodletting, power of prayer, being rubbed with a live chicken for the plague, drinking urine, lobotomies, and having holes bored in your head for mental illness. This was what was happening in a world without data. And there is a saying that medicine only became effective when people learned to count. And prior to that, we were lurching from one treatment to another, not based on whether it worked or not, because we couldn't really tell a lot of the time, but really what was consistent with prevailing beliefs or what was fashionable at the time of people who were powerful. Now, obviously from that emerged some things that were effective, like vaccination there against using cowpox against smallpox, but a lot of things were harmful and a lot of things were ineffective. So what made a difference essentially was that learning to count. And one of my favorite quotes on here is from Bertolt Brecht on his book about the life of Galileo, where he says, the aim of science is not to open the door to infinite wisdom, but to set a limit to infinite error. And I would say that it's really partly, when I say the aim of science, it's also the aim of data. So if you imagine, you know, a lot of people think that the reason we're doing quite well in terms of health, if they know we're doing well, is because of innovation. But if you imagine what we had before we learned to count was a sea of endless innovation, but no way of choosing between things that were going to work and things that didn't work. So it's not innovation alone that causes us to make progress. It's the combination of innovation with the ability to select what works. And that's why science is about setting a limit to infinite error. It lets us know where we've gone the wrong way among all the different options that we have. So when we think about public health, and I would argue that public health is the answer to almost everything. Public health is about collective experience, and collective experience is another way of talking about data, that data represent our collective experiences, using that to generate reliable evidence and then taking collective action. But really it's a loop, because you then go back to the collective experience, the evidence and the action. It's a cycle. And what's important about that is to have systems that can listen and learn and then make a difference. And data linkage are particularly important to this. They're all about our ability to listen, and they're also about our ability to learn, and they're about our ability to make a difference. And data allow us to close this loop by making experiences visible. If you imagine a situation where you cannot record cause of death, you cannot record deaths, you cannot record cancer incidents, you cannot record hospitalizations, you can't record medication use, you have this invisibility of what's going on under the surface. So I've got this cartoon here from Lunig, where you can imagine sort of mass of people living their lives, and that's kind of where it's not visible what's happening. And then large scale data are kind of like, and the generation of evidence are kind of like this understandoscope, where you can look at the population and you can get that in-depth information. Now, obviously in public health, some relationships are apparent from immediate experience. So if we're, at the moment, I'm doing some work with my team on e-cigarettes, and we can look at case reports of, for example, e-cigarette devices and injuries and burns, because we can say, yes, that device exploded in that person's pocket and they got a burn, for example. But a lot of relationships that are really important to us actually require highly sophisticated analysis. And it's all very well when we say medicine was largely ineffective until we learnt to count, but counting of this nature is a highly sophisticated activity, and it's something that's really only come into its own over the last 50 to 100 years. One of the other things about public health is it is empirical and it is largely non-judgmental. It assumes that in given circumstances, a population of people will act in a particular way. It focuses on the population and the individual. It's pragmatic, it's iterative, and it's incremental. And it's also based on probability. So it's based on, a lot of the time, it's based on large-scale data or on large-scale action. And when I say it's non-judgmental, public health is behind supervised injecting rooms, it's behind condoms in prisons, it's behind raising taxes on smoking. It's not making judgments about, obviously it's got to exist within a human rights framework, but a lot of the time it's highly pragmatic, and it's about what we know will benefit health under given circumstances. So that brings me to what I think is the only thing that truly works, and that is that evidence action cycle. So we start by getting the very best evidence regarding an intervention or something we're planning to do, and that evidence will come from multiple sources. A lot of the time there's randomized trial data, but also evidence about adverse events. We then implement that, and we then need to actually evaluate it. So if we implement something and we evaluate it, we then need to make sure that we take action based on that evaluation. So implementation, and we act an action, and we then evaluate it. So if you imagine it's something like thalidomide, we introduced with very little evidence. It was evaluated and found to cause congenital defects and pregnancy losses. We then took action to take it off the market, although it was after 46 different countries had licensed it. Now, that gap between the implementation and that effective remedial action is our capacity to harm. So we need to consider that very carefully. If you look at smoking, it was introduced to markets in the early 1900s. We found it in the 1950s and 60s about some of its harm. The evidence has been growing. We're yet to take really effective action. Although we have seen declines in Australia, and I'll talk about that, but globally, and that capacity to harm, that gap, it's 100 million deaths in the 20th century, and we look like we're on track for around 1 billion deaths in the 21st century. So that we have this real need to act and implement things based on the best possible evidence, to evaluate it carefully, but also to take action based on that evaluation. And large-scale data, and particularly data linkage, have a huge role to play in that evaluation, but also in that generation of the original evidence. So that cycle cannot work without data. So I'm going to now talk about smoking, just as an illustration of what data linkage can achieve. So none of the large-scale work on smoking that we've done would be possible without data linkage. Now, a lot of people find smoking really boring. I was asked by the editor of Cardiology Today to do an editorial, and he said, could you write it on sitting is the new smoking? And I said, well, no, David, I won't do that, but I can write one called smoking is the new smoking, because basically people, and then I thought to myself, why do people need a new smoking? And I kind of wrote the editorial from the point of view of why am I being asked to write something called sitting is the new smoking when smoking is as bad as ever. And I think it's firstly because people underestimate the harms of smoking. I think it's because people think it's solved, particularly in places like Australia, where actually it's becoming much less visible. And I think the other thing is people think it's a bit boring. So I'm going to talk to you about why it is not, why the harms are great, why it isn't solved, and why it isn't boring. So smoking causes around 8 million deaths per year now, and that's more than 10% of deaths worldwide. So if you want to know how many deaths there are every year, it's at least 80 million. As I've said, we estimate 100 million deaths in the 20th century and 1 billion in the 21st. Now, it's sort of understandable some of the deaths in the 20th century because we didn't know what smoking did. The 1 billion in the 21st century is much less excusable. We are seeing, if you look at the graphs that are here, tobacco users in millions, so that's kind of about 1.3 billion, is going down very gradually, but we still have around 1.3 billion tobacco users. It's obviously readily preventable. We have very clear evidence about what works. It's also increasingly concentrated in the poor, within and between countries, and also in the mentally ill. In Australia, we have had amazing progress against smoking. So the graph on the left shows the prevalence of current smoking among adults, and it's really rapid diminution. One of the key, there have been multiple policy interventions that have made this happen. And smoking also really illustrates that public health works through frameworks. If people say to me, well, what's the one thing we need to do for smoking? I say the whole point is there's not one thing. Just as there's no one thing that we need to do for COVID, not one thing we need to do about injuries, there's a framework of activity. So there's taxation, there's bans on advertising, there's health information, there's support for quitting, there's avoiding exposure to secondhand smoke. One of the key things that's been really effective is raising prices, and the figure in the middle, or the photo in the middle, shows you, I use this when I do international talks particularly, shows you a cigarette on one side and then all the food you can buy at, it's essentially Woolies, for the price of that packet of cigarettes. And there's a graph there showing that Australia has among the most expensive cigarettes in the world. And in fact, we're now at around $1.40 per cigarette. So that's one of the key factors, but it also means there's huge impacts for people who do smoke. There are still around 2.7 million smokers in Australia, and it remains our greatest cause of burden of disease. So not many people know that. So the data that we've used for this work is the 45 and up study, which is a cohort study. And a lot of my work, as it said in my intro, is on large-scale cohort studies, but we use data linkage to then follow those people up. I am also involved in studies that are wholly data linkage, but my main work's been on cohort studies. So it's around 250,000 participants who age 45 and over from the New South Wales general population. So that was around 10% of the population in that age group at the time. It's a data platform. So we have questionnaires, multiple follow-ups, and then linkage to health data. In this case, we're looking at linkage to hospitalisations and deaths, and also cancer registrations to do the work. There's more than 700 researchers using the data now and more than 400 publications. And this is a heat map of the first 100,000 participants and where they're based. So they're distributed across the whole of New South Wales. We actually oversample people in rural and remote areas. So half of the sample is rural and half of the sample is urban. It doesn't have anyone from the ACT in it. So there's a kind of unsightly hole in the 45 and up study. And I'm only allowed to say that because I live in the ACT. So the findings that we have from these Australian data, they were that They are the first large-scale direct data we have from Australia about the impacts of smoking on mortality, on cardiovascular disease, and on mortality in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So although Australia has been a world leader in tobacco control, we didn't have data on our population. And it's really important to have direct information on your population because the effect of smoking on health varies from population to population, and it varies over time. So up until we had these data, we were relying on worldwide averages. So for example, our estimates based on the worldwide average was that around half of all smokers would die from their habit. And those were revised up after we had these data. So in terms of the smoking and mortality findings, we followed around 200,000 people who were free of cardiovascular disease and cancer at baseline. And we found that the risk of dying during follow-up in current smokers was around 3 times that of never smokers. And broadly speaking, that means that up to 2/3 of current smokers will die from their habit. Now that sounds like going from sort of half to 2/3 may sound like, well, you know, it's pretty bad either way, but that's now used on the quit line. So it used to be that current smokers would ring up the quit line and they might be told, well, it's sort of 50-50 chance it'll get you. And a lot of people think, well, I'm kind of lucky, you know, but it's a very different message to say that it's odds on now. Smokers lose an estimated 10 years of average life expectancy, but quitting by age 45 avoids a large proportion of the excess mortality. So we've worked really hard with our partners, our policy partners, and had actually involved those policy partners throughout the research process. So we did this work in partnership with the Heart Foundation and the Cancer Council, and we've seen really widespread policy uptake of these findings, including it being used in the explanatory memorandum for the latest tobacco excise increase. We also then looked at smoking and cardiovascular disease, and we then by that time had 188,000 or 190,000 participants who were CVD and cancer free. There were 27,000 incident cardiovascular disease events. And what we found was that there was a big variation in the relative risk by subtype in current versus never smokers. So current smokers had overall a 3-fold risk of dying of cardiovascular disease compared to never smokers. But for myocardial infarction, the risk of either getting the disease or dying of it was around double. And for peripheral arterial disease, it was 5-fold. I'll give you a bit more detail about this. What we also found was that there was increasing risk with increasing intensity of smoking. And a key finding here was that an average of 5 cigarettes per day actually doubles your overall risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. So and that's equivalent to being having a BMI of 35 or more, or drinking the equivalent of like a bottle of vodka a day. So a lot of people who are smokers of 5 cigarettes a day would not consider that they're running that level of risk of cardiovascular disease. We also looked at the linked data allowed us to look at 36 different subtypes of cardiovascular disease. And we really found that there was no part of the cardiovascular system that was untouched. And I'll just give you an illustration of this. This is based on hospitalisation and death data using the ICD-10 Australian modification codes. And what we've got here is a forest plot of the relative risk of each outcome listed in current versus never smokers, and they're ranked from the highest to the lowest. And what you can see there is the vast majority of these cardiovascular subtypes were increased among current smokers compared to never smokers. And we actually have some brand new things here which had never been shown before in these types of data, which is an increased risk of cardiomyopathy and an increased risk of paroxysmal tachycardia, which can actually lead to which can be a fatal outcome. But also you can really see those big ticket items: ischemic heart disease, high blood pressure, atrial fibrillation, and those high relative risks for peripheral vascular disease. So we also found quitting reduces risk, and quitting by age 45 avoids 90% or more of the excess smoking related risk. We also found that in Australia, 15% of cardiovascular disease deaths overall, and over 1/3 of premature cardiovascular deaths are attributable to smoking. We then also looked at smoking and mortality in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, particularly Katie Verber and Ray Lovett, for this work. and we note that the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do not smoke currently. It's around 40% current adult daily smoking. In the 45 and up study, there were 1,388 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants who were cardiovascular disease and cancer-free at baseline. There were 162 deaths among those people. And apologies, this is a little bit out of focus. I did the kind of snapshot and cut and paste from the paper. But essentially what we found was that in current versus never smokers, there's around a 4-fold increase in risk of dying during the follow-up period. And that's actually consistent. The confidence intervals are consistent with the finding of the relative risk overall in the general population. Past versus never smokers, it's around 2-fold. This is the first direct evidence from a cohort study of this type among an Indigenous population worldwide. We also found that never smokers lived on average 10 years longer than current smokers. And I think the key finding that was really stark from this work was that 50% of deaths in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 45 and over can be attributed to tobacco. And over 1/3 of all deaths in Aboriginal people can be attributed to tobacco. So we didn't have this evidence before, and it's a really key part of going forward and putting the appropriate emphasis on smoking in the general population, but also for this population. And I'd like to acknowledge, I've got a logo there from the Tackling Indigenous Smoking work. I'd like to acknowledge all of the work that, that people have been doing in this area over time. And smoking has been responsible for more than 10,000 deaths in the past decade among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people based on these data. So, in conclusion, public health is the answer to almost everything. And I think it's really important for us to imagine and remember and reflect on life without reliable data, and to work hard to make sure that we continue to strive for the best possible evidence to guide health. Data and data linkage are absolutely critical to improving health because they allow us to make the invisible visible and close that loop. They allow us to take informed action, and they allow us to create systems that listen and learn. I just want to say that smoking is something, you know, it's the biggest no-brainer there is, really, and I think we know what works and we need to go in harder. I'd like to conclude by thanking the people who've participated in this study and the authors and collaborators. I'd like to thank the 45 and Up study team. I'd particularly like to thank all of you out there in data linkage land, particularly the Centre for Health Record Linkage, all the data custodians and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, partner agencies and funders, and also the ANU. And I'd like to conclude with a picture of our campus, which is officially smoke-free. So that concludes my talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Banks. That was fantastic. And from another smoke-free campus, we're getting there. We are. If anyone has any questions for Professor Banks, if you could type them into the Q&A box. We have some time for questions at the moment. I guess I could get us started. And I've noticed that you've done, you were going through quite a lot of Indigenous health data there. Are there any particular issues with working with Indigenous health data that you've found?
So I think the first thing is, whatever we do in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, we need to make sure that we're working in partnership. And I have to say, actually, all the sort of IT problems at the beginning, I didn't do a formal acknowledgement of country. And I'd like to just say that I'm on the wonderful lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to thank Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for the privilege of living and working on your lands. Yeah, so the first thing is, there's really important to work in partnership and to make sure that principles of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data sovereignty are followed. So that's sort of the first thing, and I wouldn't call that an issue, I'd just call that a contextual factor. Certainly you can see from the work that we've done, there are lots of areas where the health gaps that we're seeing are compounded by data gaps. And we really need to make sure that we're getting the best possible data we can to guide us in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. So you can see with the 45 and Up study, that was not a study that was specifically designed for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. it happened to recruit a large cohort of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we happened to be able to do the data linkage for that. The next generation is really work being led by Ray Lovett and other colleagues like him, with large-scale cohorts that are actually led and governed by Aboriginal people. So the Maikuai study is an example of that. It's now got 11,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants across Australia, and there'll be data linkage related to that. So that's getting established. So I think we do have issues in terms of data availability. We've also done quite a bit of work using the ABS Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Survey, and that's been really important. I think another factor we find with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health is that quite often you are dealing with smaller numbers, and we're also dealing with really quite substantial heterogeneity of communities and of outcomes. So we have to think very carefully about how we interpret data. And then we also have quite serious, as I've said, data gaps. So when we're looking at monitoring, for example, smoking rates, we're often stuck when we get to different regions. We have really limited numbers. So we have to make sure that the investment in collecting data and collecting data in the right way is done appropriately.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a couple of questions. Anonymous attendee says, thank you, Professor Banks, for the talk. Could you please advise what are the important or priority things to consider when working with large data sets?
Okay, well, that's a very broad question. So I think if I was going to, I'd sort of want to categorize that a bit. I think I would divide that into kind of the questions that you're asking. I'd also be thinking about the quality of the data, and I'd be thinking about the analysis, and then I'd be thinking about what you're going to do with it. So under those headings, the first thing when working with large-scale data is to actually think very, very carefully about what the question is you want to look at. I think error looks beautiful at scale. It's very easy to look at things, well, not easy, but it's very easy to be misled by findings from large-scale data because they look compelling. So it's really, really important to make sure that you've really carefully worked through your research questions, that you know that you've got data that are fit for purpose for that. But also it's really, really important to have some sort of data analysis plan where you've actually articulated what the hypotheses are you're testing and how you're going to do the analysis. Because one of the other things that can happen with large scale data is if you kind of dive in without a plan, it's very inefficient, but also you can end up with things being data derived. It's kind of like you shoot at a wall and then draw the target afterwards. You've got to be really clear to do the target first and make sure that you've got a clear hypothesis and research questions. You need to have really good data quality and to understand the quality of the data that you're dealing with. It's very variable a lot of the time. And also it's not so much, it's also about, I would say, horses for courses. Have you got the data that are right for the answer that you're right for the question and right for what you're looking at? The other thing is you do need the technical expertise to analyze the data. And I know I'm speaking to a lot of people out there who really have that expertise. It's not common. It's very difficult to find people who can really analyze large-scale data appropriately. And they need to be doing the right kind of analyses. And then at the other end, you need to make sure that you're not over-interpreting or under-interpreting your data. What I find is there's a tendency for people to get caught up in the minutiae of what they don't know. And part of what we need to be doing is really stating the obvious and really stating where the data are clear. So the findings about Aboriginal health and smoking have been really staring us in the face for quite a long time. We're not, but we needed to make sure that we focus on that as large scale data and on the big ticket items rather than what we don't know. The other thing is then with large scale data is working in partnership with your end users and with people who are going to be implementing findings relating to it in as much of the process as possible. And I would say, I would try and get those people involved all the way through, because there's no point in doing this kind of work if it doesn't make any difference to anybody. And in order to bring about action, you need to be partnering with the people who are actually the ones who are capable of making a difference on the ground.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question, Yang Peng has asked, when you were examining the smoking across the life expectancy, were you comparing it to the general population using life tables or comparing to the people who have never smoked in the cohort?
So those analyses are sort of hypotheticals based on the relative risk, applying it in such a way that it's comparing the current smokers to people who are either non-smokers or never smokers. So it's not saying that smokers have 10 years less than the average life expectancy. It's saying that they've got 10 years less average life expectancy compared to people who don't smoke. So the overall life expectancy in Australia is actually affected by smoking in the population. And in fact, Australia has had incredible health outcomes. We've seen an over 80-90% drop in cardiovascular mortality over the last 50 years. And that's driven really massive drops in overall mortality. Smoking has been one of the key factors. Reductions in smoking has been one of the key factors there, along with reductions in blood pressure and better treatment and things like the risk factors, but also better treatment of people with cardiovascular disease.
Great. Shannon Diaz asks, did your study analyze data on subcohorts from non-English speaking backgrounds, just out of interest given the high rates of immigration and asylum?
So we have around 25% of the cohort were not born in Australia. So we do have a number of groups there, but it's not, the sample size was not big enough to really go into a lot of detail in those populations. Also because within that population, there's quite a bit of heterogeneity. So you can sort of look broadly at born in Australia, not born in Australia. And the other variables we've got in the 45 and up study are whether or not someone's born in Australia and their ancestry. But in any case, you can end up with born in Australia, not born in Australia, but among those not born in Australia, there's a lot of people who have got a sort of UK background or an English-speaking background. So the numbers in the different specific ethnic groups or country of birth groups can get quite small in terms of trying to look at different risk factors. Having said that, there is quite a bit of work in the 45 and up study that has looked in migrants at lots of different factors. So I'd really encourage Yan Ping to go and have a look at the list of publications. If you put 45 and up study into a search engine, you'll be directed to the Sachs Institute's website. And you can see that there are quite a number of studies there that have looked at the health of people from different migrant groups. And we certainly know that smoking varies according to where people are from. So we see, for example, really quite high smoking rates or smoking prevalence among people who are, particularly among men from the Middle East and men from China. There are also sex differentials that vary according to where people are from. So very low smoking prevalence in women born in Asia, for example.
Great. Lachlan Dolly says, thank you, Professor Banks, for such a fantastic overview of your work in data linkage. I'm just wondering whether previous and current smoking was collected in the 45 and up study, or was it identified using administrative claims? If it was available in both data sets, have you been able to look at the reliability of the recording of smoking ICD-10 codes in administrative data?
Okay, so this is a really, really great question because data linkage can show us many things, and it's an example of also about what is fit for purpose. So we used self-reported data on smoking status from the 45 and up study questionnaires for the exposure, and that has been shown to be really very reliable, whether or not people report, it's very reliable. If you ask someone, are they a smoker, you get pretty good data about whether or not they're a smoker. It is not reliably recorded in administrative data. So Louisa Jorm and her team have, and Sanjay Lujic is one of the people who looked at that, have shown that it's not hugely reliable, that smoking is not particularly well recorded in administrative data. But it is recorded, and I suppose the question there is, what what you're actually wanting to look at. So say you wanted to look at the whole of population and you wanted to get an idea about some smoking impacts, you would know that if you used administrative data, you'd get the whole population, but and probably the people for whom there was something saying they were a smoker, they probably would be smokers, but you couldn't reliably be assured that you would have captured all the smokers. So, but for things like use of prescription medications, linked data can be brilliant because you have dispensing data from the PBS. If you're looking at readmission following surgery for something, then you have to use linked data. So cohort data can be useful for some things and linked data can be useful for other things. The other thing another example there is that we've done quite a bit of work on body mass index and obesity. We don't have good data on that from administrative data, but we can get those data from cohort studies, and self-reported data are relatively reliable for that, particularly for ranking people's body mass index. So there are really great examples of areas where data linkage and cohort study data are a great combination when you're looking at a problem, because you can get those individual risk factors, you can look at more detail about individual relationships, but you also then can look at scale in the large-scale linked data.
That really is one of the strengths of having those exciting large cohort studies with administrative data linked. It's quite exciting. Last question, Amanabadab Eliakundu says, have you looked at the effect of new practices like shisha or hookah among young populations in Australia?
So our study recruited people from 2006 to 2009. That's the 45 and up study. And the median year of recruitment is 2008. And we then have follow-up questionnaires, and the group of people is 45 and over at that baseline recruitment. So the cohort is getting older. And we did not collect information at baseline on things like e-cigarettes or the other smoking practices. But also those, so we didn't look at those. This is really about conventional combustible smoking.
Fantastic. All right. Hang on just a second. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Banks, for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate you spending the time with us. Just letting everyone know, our next linkage luminary is Professor David Preen, and he is going to be talking on the 11th of August. Please register. We'll see you then, and everyone stay safe and well. Thank you.